shared with you over email, the overarching question that I'm presenting on today that will hopefully lead to a really good discussion afterwards is how can we reflect on our own journeys towards the greater and utilize what we have learned and experienced to help bring the vision of JESEDU-Jogja2024 to life. And then as an additional point, how does this type of reflection fit into the offerings of Living Ad Maiorem? The name Living Ad Maiorem, which comes partially from the unofficial motto of the Society of Jesus, means living towards the greater, and was inspired by the stories that many of us shared in Puerto Rico and the depth of relationship that began with each other there and has continued ever since, and the depth of the relationship that was also born in Indonesia this summer with all of us that were present there. So I think it's best to start with a high-level understanding of what this seminar was about. Obviously, there is at least one person on this call that was there with me, so for her, it would be a review of this. But what was this thing that we all traveled halfway across the world to go to? And as many of us know, there's a lot of documents available to us on Educate Magis, ones that we've used for years and ones that are fairly new as well. And one of them is this document, A Living Tradition. And I put this graphic up on the screen because this document put together in 2019 is one that brings together all the previous documents on education, as well as what we know from General Congregation 36, the most recent congregation where Sosa was elected. So happy 8-year anniversary to Father Sosa this week. And the apostolic preferences and other statements from global gatherings like the one we had this summer. So in Living Tradition, there are 10 global identifiers of schools. You see those on the wheel on the screen. And I want to highlight just 2 of these that were especially relevant background to the seminar in Indonesia. Oops, I went backwards, sorry. The first one was the first identifier. Jesuit schools are committed to being Catholic and to offering in-depth faith formation in dialogue with other religions and worldviews. This is actually a lot of what our current round of global gatherings, including Jesuit Jogja, was about, what this means for our school, how we do it, what's our vision for the future. So you'll hear a lot of remnants of this global identifier through what we'll reflect on today. But we also had this one, number 8, Jesuit schools are committed to being a global network at service of mission. This one reminds us that we have to network and connect with others outside of our local school, outside of our particular North American province, even outside of JSN North America. It means that we have to dialogue with everyone across the globe. It helps us understand the entire context. And of course, since we are more connected than ever before, it reminds us to use those connections in service of mission. These 2 paragraphs from GC 36 are also important background for Jesuit Jogja. As a reminder, it was in 2016 with this document produced in 2017. And some of the words that I highlighted are really things that came up in our experience and words that you'll see coming up in this presentation. And then finally, 2 of our 4 apostolic preferences, even though I'm sure all 4 of them were present in our experience, showing the way to God through the spiritual exercises and discernment and journeying with the youth and the young people accompanying them in the creation of a hope-filled future. These 2 really came up a great deal. And as a side note, it was really incredible to see firsthand how seriously the Society of Jesus is taking these preferences, how seriously they're asking the question of how do we educate for faith given the world that we find ourselves in now. And this mission that's both rooted in what the original companions intended and reads the signs of the times today. So this is the process. I don't know if you've seen this before. The dates are a little off because COVID kind of moved things in the second cycle, but the first cycle was about discovering your apostolic potential. And the second cycle is where Jesuit Jogja found itself in this cycle of walking as a global network at the service of mission. So what happened out of the first cycle? That was a living tradition. A living tradition came out of the first cycle not to replace things we'd had before, so characteristics of a Jesuit education in 1986, Ignatian Pedagogy, A Practical Approach in 1993. It was really to put those together and then to also produce a document that will help schools discern what's happening right now. So where have we been, where are we right now, and where are we going? So the hope is that as we go through this second cycle, something like this will be produced at the end of that as well, not from our seminar part, but from the whole cycle, the cycle as a whole. So who are the people that show up at these gatherings? This is the map that many of you, if you followed Educate Magis on social media, might have seen many of us pointing to our various countries. This is the one that they use to show that we are, as a global network, 6 regions, 72 countries, 870,000 students in 874 Jesuit schools. It's incredible to think about this as our network. People from Africa, Madagascar, Asia Pacific, Europe, Latin America, North America, South Asia, delegates from all 6 regions gathered together in Indonesia to have this conversation. And then one other thing I want to point out before we get into what the goals of this particular part of the process was. This was led by not only the Jesuits in Indonesia, but also the International Commission on the Apostolate of Jesuit Education, or ACAJE. And they met with Pope Francis in May 2024. And they talked about JESEDU-Jogja, and Pope Francis was highlighting how important this was going to be. Without a true relationship between educators and the Lord, nothing else is possible, was a quote that he said to this group. And then he followed us to Indonesia. He was there just a couple weeks ago. It is the closest I may ever come to degrees of separation from Pope Francis. So I like to look at that, but also that it highlights that this is not just a Jesuit level conversation, but really a church level conversation as well. So these were the 100 delegates from all 6 regions. We were really tired in this picture and very hot, but luckily it's from far away. Again, we were from all 6 regions. We were equally parts lay and Jesuit for the most part. We were all individuals serving the mission. And there were a bit more people from Indonesia, which makes sense. Led again by ACAJE and by Jose Mesa, the Worldwide Secretary for Secondary and Pre-Secondary Jesuit Education. So this was all 100, and then this was the 13 of us that were from JSN North America. So again, the goal was to have, for JSN, was to have people from each of the 5 North American provinces, to have an equal number of Jesuits and men as women. So there are 4 Jesuits, 2 laymen, 6 lay women, and then Damien, who's in the center of our picture because she was one of the keynote speakers. I remember when I first got on a call with these people, I was so humbled to be by who I was in a room with. But then as we spent 11, 12, 13 days together, I realized that we all had that same feeling. Like, who are we to be the ones invited to this place, to be in a space that felt so connected to the first companions, a space where we were able to spend intentional time considering where have we been, where are we right now, and where do we go from here. So again, backwards again. This was the process, and we are, JESEDU-Jogja was in one step along the way, 2024, not 2023. And there's another step. The next step is going to be in Montreal, Canada, where presidents, principals, superiors will meet to discuss the vision statement and what comes next. So what was our seminar specifically about? So the goal was to reflect and explore how as a global network, our responsibility and methods to educate for faith in the 21st century, so focusing on how we prepare our schools to do that. And there were 4 aims: to clarify the meaning of being a Catholic Jesuit school at service of the gospel and the church in the context of today, to promote in-depth faith formation with interreligious and multi-convictional dialogue, to clarify the place of Ignatian spirituality and faith formation process for students and educators, and then to identify the challenges and opportunities for educating for faith within a secular and religiously fundamental context. And then, of course, it resulted in this, this is just a paragraph, the highlighted paragraph of our vision statement, the key summative paragraph. But again, this is a step along the way, and this vision statement is going to lay the foundation for things that we do within JSN North America, but also what goes on globally over the next few years. Sometimes when we encounter something like this vision statement, it seems massive, and we try to figure out, well, where can we begin right now? And especially a structure that goes over 9-10 years seems slow. So where can we begin right away in our own individual context and in our own individual schools? And so the majority of this talk is structured around that. I talked about the overarching thing of what was Jesuit Yoga 2024, but now I want to share a little bit about each day, share an overarching question I was left pondering from that day's keynote, as well as our subsequent conversations, and then sharing a beginning point of reflection for us to consider. So what are the questions that we can start reflecting on right now in our own experience? So day one was Dr. Damien Zinda, who wins the prize for having the longest talk title of all. But many of us heard her talk in Puerto Rico last April to the mission formation officers. And so the goal of her talk there and the goal of her talk in Indonesia was the same. So how do we become a people of the exercises? Essentially, what I gleaned from her talk, which is like all the other keynotes still available to view on Educate Magis, was the importance of audacity, letting go of fear and moving forward in faith towards this idea of becoming people of the exercises. She invited us to reflect on questions like, how do we robustly form our leaders, our faculty, and our staff in both Ignatian spirituality and the Catholic faith? How are our formators formed and prepared to form others? And how can we move the exercises in Christ from the periphery to the center of our formation programs? But for me, her reflection left me thinking about two questions of my own experience. I think we need to start here. So how did I become, or am I becoming, a person of the exercises? And where am I in need of growth? My own journey through the exercises was somewhat convoluted. When I became a director of campus ministry, the previous director, who was a Jesuit moving on to his next stage of formation, highly recommended that I first get a spiritual director and engage in regular spiritual direction. And second, when I was ready, do the 19th annotation. But over the next almost 10 years, I had a lot of excuses for why that didn't happen. I was learning my job. I was in graduate school. I was getting a master's in theology. I was getting married and having 3 babies all during my first 3 years on the job. And then when I was finally ready to get a spiritual director, I just kept pairing up with the wrong ones for me. It was easy to see spiritual direction and the exercises as a necessary step along the way, instead of what they are, a way of developing an ever-deepening relationship with God, and a way of getting to better know myself and what I was created for. It was also easy for me to convince myself that I knew what the exercises were because I had read extensively about them. I had prayed with their themes. I had even designed and directed retreats around those themes. I was very slow on the uptake that one cannot really know what the exercises were until they had experienced them. I started to become a person of the exercises by first finally connecting with a spiritual director that was right for me. She was a woman, a fellow writer, someone long distance and disconnected from my day-to-day, and going through the exercises with her. But of course, that wasn't enough either. I may have spent some time convincing myself that it was. After all, it made sense, like a logic statement, and math makes sense. I went through the exercises, therefore I was a person of the exercises. But it wasn't until I studied them as well that I felt like the exercises began to be a part of me, and I saw how it started seeping into how I showed up in the world. So where am I in need of growth? For me right now, that growth is leading another person through the exercises and seeing what more I can discover about God and myself through that experience. I want to give you an opportunity to pause for just a minute and think about these two questions quietly from your own experience. So day 2. On day 2, we had Dr. Fatima Hussein, a professor of philosophy of religion at a local university in Yogyakarta. She has her doctorate in Indonesian and Islamic studies, and she engaged us in a discussion on educating for interreligious dialogue. This is what stuck out to me. She talked about what does interreligious dialogue look like in our varied contexts. So for example, in Indonesia, students must learn their religion, their stated religion, from teachers who also have that religion, even in public schools. So they have to have that religious instruction in their religion. And that's true in a Jesuit school as well. She asked, why is there a fear to engage? Why do we underestimate the strength of our own faith or the strength of another's? She invited us to consider what are the limits of dialogue depending on our context. And then she also shared with us her own desires for her son's education, one that's diverse in many ways, including religious studies. But in that diversity, she also wants him to have a good foundation in their Islamic faith as well. So the overarching question was, how do we engage in interreligious dialogue, especially in a variety of contexts? Which had me thinking about these two questions for me. How have I or am I experiencing dialogue with others whose religious beliefs are different from my own? And where am I in need of growth? One of the more profound experiences I've had before this summer, of course, of engaging in dialogue with someone whose faith was distinct from my own was through my first visit to Congregation Beth Torah, a Reformed Jewish congregation in DFW, for their annual Reading of the Names event. This is an annual event for them where 24 hours straight, they take turns reading names of those who died in the Holocaust. While they read the names, stacks of papers with the other names that have been read in prior years sit around the space. Even with 24 straight hours, the dent in the overall number of names each year is relatively small, but profoundly meaningful. In the Jewish faith, the tradition of honoring one's Yazaret is based on the notion that no one is truly dead until the very last time that anyone living says the person's name aloud. In preparation for this event, the students and I had training from the fathers of one of our alums who told us about this tradition, as well as allowing us the opportunity to ask questions and answer some of his questions as well. Through our dialogue with him, we were able to grow an understanding of the Jewish faith and gain an understanding of our own. So where am I in need of growth? Oddly enough, in just the last few weeks, I had an encounter with someone where I made the assumption that they knew, simply by being nature of being Christian, what Catholicism was all about. That assumption on my part delayed the opportunity for them to learn about my faith and for me to learn about theirs. Not only could I grow in recognizing the lenses I bring to a conversation, but also in having more succinct explanations at the ready when someone asks me questions like, can you tell me what your Catholic faith means to you? Or even, what is the Mass and how may it be different from our communion services? Or, what are these spiritual exercises you keep going on about? These are answers I definitely know, but I wonder if I have a response that will make sense to a given listener in a given moment. So what about you? So day 3, this was the let's not just talk about encountering other faith traditions, but let's actually do it day. Also the let's get out and see the religious plurality of Yogyakarta firsthand and how these faiths are already in dialogue with one another. The overarching question for that day was, how are we people of encounter? We made 3 stops. The first was to Prambanan Temple. It's the first 2 pictures on the left. my left, I don't know about your left, a 9th century Hindu temple compound. It's the largest compound, 240 temples in all in Indonesia, and one of the most beautiful in Southeast Asia. It's actually located near Buddhist temples as well, which is a representation of religious tolerance and the peaceful and harmonious religious life in Indonesia. We mainly walked around the temples listening to the history in our ears and encountering a lot of teenage groups that wanted to meet us. The second was to Kodagede Mosque, built in 15th century. It was the oldest mosque in Yogyakarta. Muslims built the main building while Hindus built the fence around it, a sign of acculturation between Islam and Hinduism at the time. I was struck by our walk from lunch to the mosque, which felt like, if I could imagine what it felt like, walking through an ancient biblical town. Very narrow streets, simple homes, but a community connected in faith. At the mosque, we were given a rundown of the Muslim faith by the imam in the open air part of the temple grounds, and then invited into the main interior part of the temple to look around as well. We removed our shoes, and women wore headscarves out of respect. So that's the middle two pictures. And then our last stop was at the Temple of the Sacred Heart of Jesus Ganjaran, built in 1927. It had a Javanese style of architecture, and in one part it had a Hindu-like temple that housed the Sacred Heart of Jesus. But it wasn't the Sacred Heart of Jesus as I was used to seeing him in our North American context. It was the Sacred Heart of Jesus where Jesus looked like a Javanese king. And so it really opened my eyes to how Christ appears to people, how Christ speaks to people in different contexts. So it's a Catholic shrine, but it is open to all who want to come and pray. So what I considered after this experience was, besides this journey, when have I had the opportunity to enter into another's experience, pray alongside them, and walk with them? And where can I grow? So someone asked me on the walk from the lunch to the mosque if we had mosques in DFW, and if I had ever heard the call to prayer before. To the first question, I said, yes, of course we do. I could even explain where a few of them were in my town. But to the second, I responded, no. I explained that the ones nearest to me are not open air like the ones here. They're behind closed doors and behind walls, much like our other churches. So I had never heard the call to prayer before being in Indonesia. But I realized after reflecting on that experience that it wasn't simply because, unlike Yogyakarta, we didn't have open air mosques all doing the call to prayer at once, so it reverberated over the entire country. Sure, that's true, but I had never heard the call to prayer before because I had never been inside of a mosque in my own town. I had to go halfway around the world to do so. So if I have to think about my growth in this area, that reaction definitely points to it. Take a minute to consider these questions for yourself. So day 4, you'll have to listen to this guy to truly understand all of what he spoke about, and all the videos are still up on Educate Magis. But it was an extension as well as a clarification of what those of us who were in Puerto Rico heard about the dialogue school. In particular, he addressed questions like, how do we teach for a viable faith in a secular age? How do we recognize that secularism is neither our friend nor our enemy, but our context? How do we ensure in-depth faith formation and keep our frame open to the experiences of those around us? And he also spoke about a process that's familiar, based on many processes we use in the Catholic Church and in Ignatian circles. the process of naming the experience, analyzing the context, dialoguing within the tradition of our faith, and only then developing the vision for action. And of course, reviewing it and doing it all over again. The main questions I was left to reflect on for myself were, how has my own faith developed over the years? How resilient is it? Is my own faith frame open? And where can I grow? What really resonated with me from Dr. Sharkey's talk was the need for a both and. I have to really know my faith well and be in dialogue with other faiths. I remember clearly coming to a Jesuit school 18 years ago, thinking I knew my Catholic faith well. After all, I had been in Catholic schools since I was 4 years old. I remember also clearly how that understanding was broken down and rebuilt as I came to know Catholic social teaching more intimately and directly, and as I came to know myself better and my relationship with God better through Ignatian spirituality and later the exercises. I try to keep that 27-year-old me in my head every time I encounter another person on the journey, because I want to free myself to meet them where they are so that we can go forward together. It is so easy to judge her now, but an open frame is not one of judgment to anyone on this journey, including our past selves. So where am I in need of growth? I think I need to sit more with this idea of secularism as our context and how it, like religions other than our own, demands dialogue instead of dismissal. Take a minute to consider these questions for yourself. And finally, day 5, Dr. Father Daniel Huang. This guy was amazing. I highly recommend his video. I took so many notes, I had to borrow paper from one of my new friends from Jakarta. He brought these ideas to our school context, reminding us that all human life is in the school, but so is grace, that faith itself builds community. He reminded us that Jesus gathered a community, invited people to be a part of it, but then they had to make the decision to stay. Here are a few things that I got from his talk. Our response has to be a response to the concrete persons in front of us. It has to be a response that's not one of imposition, but invitation. A response that is a path, not an inflexible, concrete model. He presented 4 models of evangelization from the history of the church, but really focused on the Emmaus model, asking, how does the risen Lord enkindle faith on the road to Emmaus? Primarily through accompaniment. He also said if we cannot bring people to faith in Jesus, then we can try to bring them to the faith of Jesus. And he said with Ignatian evangelization, it is centered on the relationship where all feel seen, heard, valued, and accompanied. And that above all, we must listen to the yearnings of the youth. So I thought that these questions were a good place to start, to try and reflect on how my own faith in Christ was kindled by the exercises, but also by having mentors and guides who were steeped in the exercises. So I wrote about this in my reflection for Educate Magis on the vision statement. And I wanted to repeat just this paragraph here. When I walked in the door of a Jesuit school for the first time 18 years ago, I had no idea how its mission, rooted in Christ and expressed through the gifts of Ignatian spirituality and the spiritual exercises, would profoundly change my life. It was not long before I was walking the halls daily, encountering people who just embodied the mission in their words and actions. It was this intangible something present in so many of my new colleagues that sparked a desire in me to get to know Ignatius and Ignatian spirituality more deeply. Really, their lived example sparked a desire in me to get to know Christ more deeply. In turn, the more that I engaged in my own spiritual formation and shared that fruits of that formation with others, the more others began to see the possibility for transformation in their own lives. So where am I in need of growth? I think I need to ask myself, how am I actually being that person who embodies the exercises to those around me? And how am I not? How often am I forgetting that in order to see Christ at work, people need to see it through me and through all of us? So take a moment to reflect on these questions for yourself. So that was a lot. Remember, we started here with this question: how can we reflect on our own journeys towards the greater and utilize what we have learned and experienced to help bring this vision to life? And then we looked at these questions for self-reflection, but with each of them, the question of where am I in need of growth? When it comes to what living ad maiorem is about, it's about this idea that our experience and our stories matter. They are the way that spirituality can come to life for the people that we serve. The more stories we have, the more complete our understanding of God, of ourselves, our community can be. And the more that this vision can be brought to life.